The report, tax report that was done, which is reported about the Matalon report in 2004, made note of the fact that there's a high tax on labor relative to capital, and therefore the question of the overburdening, particularly of the lower income earners in our society, and the need for us to ensure that there's a greater sense of balance and equity and justice in the tax distribution. The income tax threshold, far too low. Joe alluded to that. Too many persons still have to pay tax but fall within the scope of the poverty framework, and therefore we have to ensure that we will hold that. We support a recommendation from the committee that there ought to be a shift more from direct to indirect taxation, and that certainly that would allow for greater flexibility among consumers and workers in terms of the choices that they have as to what it is that they spend the income on. The real income of the poor must be protected. One of the things recommended by the committee was the need for a social fund to be established, because I think it also recognized that however much you reform the tax system, in particular the shift from the direct to the indirect taxation, is also likely to have an impact on the workers and the working poor, and therefore there is a need to ensure that there is a social fund that provides protection for them. And I suppose in a similar way, protecting people who have to include journalists. And I also think that it is important for us to recognize that any reform of our tax system has to lead to growth so I don't think that there's any disagreement among reasonable persons about the fact that some of these problems exist, that the reform of the tax system must provide some of those benefits primarily to the person, well, let us examine the recent tax measures announced by the Minister of Finance against the background of two or three other critical things that I spoke about, the need for economic growth amongst the people of this movement, and also the importance of ensuring that there is a sense of equity and fairness in our tax system. To a large extent, economic growth depends on several things, not the least of which, of course, is the efficient tax system. Part of that has to be represented in a number of ways. It certainly has to do with the level of tax which the government can and will raise. It has to do with the mix of taxes that are available. It has to do with the quality of our tax administration. It has to do with the complexity of tax rules and tax compliance costs. And it has to do with the certainty and predictability of the tax to be paid by both the householder and the business persons. The broadening of the tax base is also very important in that regard, so that economic growth is going to be, to a large extent, contingent upon a tax reform policy that takes into account, that takes into consideration all these factors. and to do so in a way that, as I said earlier, provides equity and fairness in the tax system. A recent report on tax policy reform and economic growth among OECD countries, that was recent as 2010, noted, and I quote, a growth-oriented tax reform would shift part of the tax burden from income to consumption. And in order to make it more conducive to economic growth, levying taxes on a broader base, possibly at a lower rate, rather than providing targeted relief. In general sentiments, I think Joe expressed about the PSOJ's position, as well as in the Matalon report on tax reform. So that there's a general sense, not only among us, but certainly in the developed countries as well, that these are some of the conditions which must exist to ensure that the reform of the tax is as equitable and as fair and as just as possible. The OECD report goes on to say that many countries have cut top personal income tax rates as well as corporate tax rates, while they have broadened, especially the corporate income tax base, and have increased social security contribution over time. So I think that the general point that is being made is that there has to be an emphasis on ensuring that the tax structure provides for a broadening of the tax base, that there is the necessity, as always, to provide protection to the lower income earners, and that the system ought to be efficient and ought to provide the basis to stimulate the economic investment, growth, and job creation. The minister, in his recent announcement, mentioned a number of tax measures, some of which were formed part of the recommendation of the Tax Review Committee report, two of which, of course, are the removal of the transfer tax on stamp duties and securities, and the reduction in the rate of transfer tax for states. The GCT on second sale motor vehicle, it's important to note that has increased by 400% in some cases. The motor vehicle licensing fee, that has increased by $1,000, that is for fees below $24. Most vehicles would fall in that category. And those are aspects of the tax measures, some of the tax measures which were announced by the minister. And it is important and instructive to remind ourselves as to what the Matalon report, and we all remember these are reference for familiarity, but that the report actually spoke about the importance of treating the tax reform recommendations as a package. And I read page 1 of the introduction of the report. It says that the reform package presented should not be considered simply as a menu of reform options from which preferred positions may be selected. And I think that essentially what it is saying, that if you're going to implement it, you do so wholesomely. Certainly, that has not happened in terms of the government's announcements last week, and certainly it doesn't complete the entire picture that ought to be addressed in this regard. But the report also went on to look at two approaches to the implementation, what they call the phased approach or the big bang approach. And in its final recommendation, it came down on the side of the big bang approach. That is to say, to do everything at the same time, so that it has an impact. One of the things that we have contended for at NOS is that if economic, particularly as we face this present crisis, is if economic growth is going to be derived in the context of the depression in which we are, then a large part of that is the responsibility, not of the private sector, but of government. That government has to do sufficient to stimulate the economy so that consumer confidence can rise, so that private sector investors can feel confident enough to invest in the economy, because there is sufficient workers earning sufficient income to stimulate aggregate demand and to increase the demand for goods and services. It behoves us to recognize that there is nothing, certainly in the Minister of Finance pronouncements, that does anything to stimulate a fall in consumer confidence, that there is no job creation, that there is no increase in income for consumer spending. And therefore, all the measures which have been announced, important as they are, will not be sufficient to stimulate the economy, because there will be no consumer with the wherewithal, with the resources to be able to purchase these goods and services. And that is why, come back to the MTC's report, the need to have implemented the recommendations on a whole scale. Some concluding remarks I will therefore make, and some recommendations, is that we have to move very quickly in terms of certainly broadening our tax base, because the last figures that I saw, I was trying to get an update with our success, is that we have perhaps roughly about 350,000 people who pay somewhere in the region of about $52 billion in contribution to tax revenue. We roughly have about the same in terms of own account, self-employed, who pay somewhere in the region of about $3 billion in tax revenue. That level of inequity certainly has to be curbed. The lowering of the corporate tax, whilst we support it, there has to be some measure, some way to ensure that there is a commensurate increase, and I think George alluded to that, expenditure in the area of research and development, training, investment. Because in the final analysis, certainly what we need is to ensure that we are producing the right product, the right quality, quantity, and that we have persons with the resources and the capability to be able to utilize those. We also believe that there's a certain recommendation made by the opposition spokesman on finance about this money from the JDIP, some $4 billion plus which he believes are to be expended in the area of infrastructure work. And that is certainly an important way of stimulating the economy and providing jobs, of course, and the revenue and some of the income for the transportation. And the final point I will make is that the extension of the existing agreement is going to require a level of social dialogue and interaction and consultation. I don't think that the government should enter an extension without any form of consultation with the major stakeholders and the Jamaican people, because of the likely implication. Certainly I took note of the fact that the PSOJ was consulted in respect of the budget process. Certainly I can speak on behalf of the government as absolutely consultation. Take account of the fact that we're trying to build a partnership with the main partners being Labour Capital and civil society in the consultation ought to be broad.
All right, thank you, Mr. Roberts.